Chapter 17 of Babbitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 17. 1. There are but 3 or 4 old houses in Floral Heights, and in Floral Heights an old house is one which was built before 1880. The largest of these is the residence of William Washington Eathorne, president of the First State Bank. The Eathorne mansion preserves the memory of the nice parts of Zenith, as they appeared from 1860 to 1900. It is a red brick immensity with gray sandstone lintels, and a roof of slate in courses of red, green, and dyspeptic yellow. There are 2 anemic towers, one roofed with copper, the other crowned with cast-iron ferns. The porch is like an open tomb. It is supported by squat granite pillars, above which hang frozen cascades of brick. At one side of the house is a huge stained-glass window in the shape of a keyhole. But the house has an effect not at all humorous. It embodies the heavy dignity of those Victorian financiers who ruled the generation between the pioneers and the brisk sales engineers, and created a somber oligarchy by gaining control of banks, mills, land, railroads, mines. Out of the dozen contradictory Zeniths, which together make up the true and complete Zenith, none is so powerful and enduring, yet none so unfamiliar to the citizens as the small, still dry, polite, cruel Zenith of the William Eathornes. And for that tiny hierarchy the other Zeniths unwittingly labor and insignificantly die. Most of the castles of the testy Victorian tetrarchs are gone now, or decayed into boarding-houses, but the Eathorne mansion remains, virtuous and aloof, reminiscent of London, Black Bay, Rittenhouse Square. Its marble steps are scrubbed daily, the brass plate is reverently polished, and the lace curtains are as prim and as superior as William Washington Eathorne himself. With a certain awe Babbitt and Chum Frink called on Eathorne for a meeting of the Sunday School Advisory Committee. With uneasy stillness they followed a uniformed maid through the catacombs of reception-rooms to the library. It was as unmistakably the library of a solid old banker as Eathorne's side whiskers were the side whiskers of a solid old banker. The books were, most of them, standard sets, with the correct and traditional touch of dim blue, dim gold, and glossy calfskin. The fire was exactly correct and traditional, a small, quiet, steady fire, reflected by polished fire-irons. The oak desk was dark and old and altogether perfect. The chairs were gently supercilious. Eathorne's inquiries as to the health of Mrs. Babbitt, Miss Babbitt, and the other children were softly parental, but Babbitt had nothing with which to answer him. It was indecent to think of using the "How's tricks, old socks?" which gratified Vergil Gunch and Frink and Howard Littlefield, men who till now had seemed successful and urbane. Babbitt and Frink sat politely, and politely did Eathorne observe, opening his thin lips just wide enough to dismiss the words, "Gentlemen, before we begin our conference, you may have felt the cold in coming in here, so good of you to save an old man the journey. Shall we perhaps have a whiskey toddy?" So well trained was Babbitt in all the conversation that befits a good fellow that he almost disgraced himself with, "Rather than make trouble, and always providin' there ain't any enforcement officers hiding in the wastebasket." The words died choking in his throat. He bowed in flustered obedience. So did Chum Frink. Eathorne rang for the maid. The modern and luxurious Babbitt had never seen any one ring for a servant in a private house, except during meals. Himself in hotels had rung for bellboys, but in the house you didn't hurt Matilda's feelings. You went out in the hall and shouted for her. Nor had he, since Prohibition, known any one to be casual about drinking. It was extraordinary merely to sip his toddy and not cry, "Oh, Mama, this hits me right where I live." and always with the ecstasy of youth meeting greatness. He marveled, "That little fuzzy face there, why, he could make me or break me if he told my banker to call my loan. Gosh, that quarter-sized squirt, and looking like he hadn't got a single bit of hustle in him. I wonder, do we boosters throw too many fits about pep?" From this thought he shuddered away and listened devoutly to Eathorne's idea on the advancement of the Sunday School, which were very clear and very bad. Diffidently Babbitt outlined his own suggestions. "I think if you analyze the needs of the school, in fact, going right at it is as if it were a merchandising problem. The course of the one basic and fundamental need is growth. I presume we're all agreed we won't be satisfied till we build up the biggest darn Sunday school in the whole state, so the Chatham Road Presbyterian won't have to take anything off anybody. Now about jazzing up the campaign for prospects. They've already used contesting teams and given prizes to the kids that bring in the most members, and they made a mistake there. The prizes were a lot of folderols and doodads like poetry books and illustrated testaments, instead of something a real live kid would want to work for, like real cash or a speedometer for his motorcycle. Course, I suppose it's all fine and dandy to illustrate the lessons with those decorated bookmarks and blackboard drawings and so on, but when it comes down to the real he-hustling, getting out and drumming up customers, or members, I mean, why, you got to make it worth a fellow's while. Now I want to propose 2 stunts. First, divide the Sunday School into 4 armies, depending on age. Everybody gets a military rank in his own army according to how many members he brings in, and the duffers that lie down on us and don't bring in any, they remains privates. The pastor and superintendent rank as generals, and everybody has got to give salutes and all the rest of that junk, just like a regular army, to make 'em feel it's worthwhile to get rank. Then, second, course, the school has its advertising committee, but Lord, nobody ever really works good. Nobody works well just for the love of it. The thing to do is be practical and up to date, and hire a real paid press agent for the Sunday School, some newspaper fellow who can give part of his time." "Sure, you bet," said Chum Frink. "Think of the nice juicy bits he could get in," Babbitt crowed. "Not only the big, salient, vital facts about how fast the Sunday School and the collection is growing, but a lot of humorous gossip and kidding. How about some blowhard fell down on his pledge to get new members, or the good time the Sacred Trinity girls had at their Winehurst party? And on the side, if he had time, press agent might even boost the lessons themselves. Do a little advertising for all the Sunday schools in town. In fact, no use being hoggish towards the rest of 'em, providing we can keep the bulge on 'em in membership. For instance, he might get the papers to course I haven't got a literary training like Frank here, and I'm just guessing how the pieces ought to be written, but take, for instance, suppose the week's lesson is about Jacob. Well, the press agent might get in something that would have a fine moral, and yet with a trick headline that'd get folks to read it. Say, like, Jake fools the old man, makes getaway with girl and bankroll. So I mean, that'd get your interest. Now, of course, Mr. Eathorne, you're conservative, and maybe you feel these stunts would be undignified, but honestly, I believe they'd bring home the bacon." Eathorne folded his hands on his comfortable little belly and purred like an aged pussy. "I say that I have been very much pleased by your analysis of the situation, Mr. Babbitt. As you surmise, it's necessary in my position to be conservative and perhaps endeavor to maintain a certain standard of dignity. Yet I think you'll find me somewhat progressive in our bank, for example. I hope I may say that we have as modern a method of publicity and advertising as any in the city. Yes, I fancy you'll find us oldsters quite cognizant of the shifting spiritual values of the age. Yes, oh yes, And so, in fact, it pleases me to be able to say that, though personally I might prefer the sterner Presbyterian of an earlier era." Babbitt finally gathered that Eathorne was willing. Chum Frink suggested as part-time press agent one Kenneth Escott, reporter for the Advocate-Times. They parted on a high plane of amity and Christian helpfulness. Babbitt did not drive home, but toward the center of the city. He wished to be by himself and exult over the beauty of intimacy with William Washington Eathorne. 2. A snow-blanched evening of ringing pavements and eager lights. Great golden lights of trolley cars sliding along the packed snow of the roadway, demure lights of little houses, the bleaching glare of a distant foundry, wiping out the sharp-edged stars, lights of neighborhood drug-stores where friends gossiped, well pleased after the day's work, the green light of a police station and greener radiance on the snow, the drama of a patrol wagon, gong beating like a terrified heart, headlights scorching the crystal sparkling street, driver not a chauffeur but a policeman proud in uniform, another policeman perilously dangling on the step at the back, and a glimpse of the prisoner, a murderer, a burglar, a coiner, cleverly trapped. An enormous gray stone church with a rigid spire, dim light in the parlors, and cheerful throng of choir practice, the quivering green mercury vapor light of a photo-engraver's loft. Then the storming lights of downtown, parked cars with ruby tail-lights, white-arched entrances to movie theaters like frosty mouths of winter caves, electric signs, serpents, and little dancing men of fire, pink shaded globes, and scarlet jazz music in a cheap upstairs dance-hall, lights of Chinese restaurants, lanterns painted with cherry blossoms and with pagodas hung against lattices of lustrous gold and black, small dirty lamps in small stinking lunchrooms, the smart shopping district with rich and quiet light on crystal pendants and furs and suave surfaces of polished wood in velvet-hung reticent windows. High above the street an unexpected square hanging in the darkness, the window of an office where someone was working late, for a reason unknown and stimulating, a man meshed in bankruptcy, an ambitious boy, an oil man suddenly become rich. The air was shrewd, the snow was deep in uncleared alleys, and beyond the city Babbitt knew were hillsides of snowdrift among wintry oaks and the curving ice-encrusted river. He loved his city with passionate wonder. He lost the accumulated weariness of business, worry, and expansive oratory. He felt young and potential. He was ambitious. It was not enough to be a Virgil Gunch, an Orville Jones. No. "They're bully fellows, simply lovely, but they haven't got any finesse." No, he was going to be an Eathorne, delicately rigorous, coldly powerful. "That's the stuff. The wallop in the velvet mitt. Not let anybody get fresh with you. Been getting careless about my diction. Slang. Colloquial. Cut it out. I was first rate at rhetoric in college. Thames on, anyway, not bad. Had too much of this hoopadoodle and good fellow stuff. Why couldn't I organize a bank of my own some day, and Ted succeed me?" He drove happily home, and to Mrs. Babbitt was a William Washington Eathorne, but she did not notice it. 3. Young Kenneth Escott, reporter on the Advocate-Times, was appointed press agent of the Chatham Road Presbyterian Sunday School. He gave 6 hours a week to it. At least he was paid for giving 6 hours a week. He had friends on the Press and Gazette, and he was not officially known as a press agent. He procured a trickle of insinuating items about neighborliness and the Bible, about class suppers, jolly but educational, and the value of the prayer life in attaining financial success. The Sunday School adopted Babbitt's system of military ranks. Quickened by this spiritual refreshment, it had a boom. It did not become the largest school in Zenith. The Central Methodist Church kept ahead of it by methods which Dr. Drew scored as unfair, undignified, un-American, ungentlemanly, and unchristian. But it climbed from fourth place to second, and there was rejoicing in heaven, or at least in that portion of heaven included in the parsonage of Dr. Drew, while Babbitt had much praise and good repute. He had received the rank of colonel on the general staff of the school. He was plumply pleased by salutes on the street from unknown small boys. His ears were tickled to ruddy ecstasy by hearing himself called colonel, and if he did not attend Sunday school merely to be thus exalted, certainly thought about it all the way there. He was particularly pleasant to the press agent, Kenneth Escott. He took him to lunch at the athletic club and had him to the house for dinner. Like many of the cocksure young men who forage about cities in apparent contentment and who express their cynicism in supercilious slang, Escott was shy and lonely. His shrewd, starveling face broadened with joy at dinner, and he blurted, "Gee whillikers, Miss Babbitt, if you knew how good it is to have home eats again!" Escott and Verona liked each other. All evening they talked about ideas. They discovered that they were radicals. True, they were sensible about it. They agreed that all communists were criminals, that this vers libre was tommyrot, and that while there ought to be universal disarmament, of course Great Britain and the United States must, on behalf of oppressed small nations, keep a navy equal in the tonnage of all the rest of the world. But they were so revolutionary that they predicted, to Babbitt's irritation, that there would some day be a third party, which would give trouble to the Republicans and Democrats. Escott shook hands with Babbitt 3 times at parting. Babbitt maintained his extreme fondness for Eathorne. Within a week 3 newspapers presented accounts of Babbitt's sterling labors for religion, and all of them tactfully mentioned William Washington Eathorne as his collaborator. Nothing had brought Babbitt quite so much credit at the Elks, the Athletic Club, and the Boosters. His friends had always congratulated him on his oratory, but in their praise was doubt, for even in speeches advertising the city there was something highbrow and degenerate, like writing poetry. But now Orville Jones shouted across the athletic dining-room, "Here's the new director of the First State Bank." Grover Butterbaugh, the eminent wholesaler of plumber supplies, chuckled, "Wonder you mix with common folks after holding Eathorne's hand." And Emil Wengert, the jeweler, was at last willing to discuss buying a house in Dorchester. 4. When the Sunday school campaign was finished, Babbitt suggested to Kenneth Escott, "Say, how about doing a little boosting for Doc Drew personally?" Escott grinned. "You trust the doc to do a little boosting for himself, Mr. Babbitt?" "There's hardly a week goes by without his ringing up the paper to say if we'll chase a reporter up to his study he'll let us in on the story about the swell sermon he's going to preach on the wickedness of short skirts, or the authorship of the Pentateuch. Don't you worry about him. There's just one better publicity grabber in town, and that's this Dora Gibson Tucker that runs the Child Welfare and the Americanization League, and the only reason she's got Drew beaten is because she has got some brains." "Well, now, Kenneth, I don't think you ought to talk that way about the doctor. Preacher has to watch his interest, hasn't he? You remember that in the Bible about being diligent in the Lord's business or something." "All right, I'll get something in it for you if you want me to, Mr. Babbitt, but I'll have to wait till the managing editor is out of town, and then Blackjack, the city editor." Thus it came to pass that in the Sunday Advocate-Times, under a picture of Dr. Drew at his earnestest, with eyes alert, jaws granite, and rustic lock flamboyant, appeared an inscription, a wood-pulp tablet conferring 24 hours immortality. The Reverend Dr. John Jennison Drew, M.A., pastor of the beautiful Chatham Road Presbyterian Church in lovely Floral Heights, is a wizard soul winner. He holds the local record for conversions. During his shepherdhood, an average of almost 100 sin-weary persons per year have declared the resolve to lead a new life, and have found a harbor of refuge and peace. Everything zips at the Chatham Road Church. The subsidiary organizations are keyed to the top notch of efficiency. Dr. Drew is especially keen on good congregational singing. Bright, cheerful hymns are used at every meeting, and the special sing services attract lovers of music and professionals from all parts of the city. On the popular lecture platform as well as in the pulpit, Dr. Drew is a renowned word painter, and during the course of the year he receives literally scores of invitations to speak at varied functions, both here and elsewhere. 5. Babbitt let Dr. Drew know that he was responsible for this tribute. Dr. Drew called him brother and shook his hand a great many times. During the meetings of the advisory committee, Babbitt had hinted that he would be charmed to invite Eathorne to dinner, but Eathorne had murmured, "So nice of you, old man, now. Almost never go out." Surely Eathorne would not refuse his own pastor. Babbitt said boyishly to Drew, "Say, doctor, now we've put this thing over, strikes me it's up to the dominie to blow the three of us for a dinner." "Bully, you bet. Delighted," cried Dr. Drew, in his manifest way. Some one had once told him that he talked like the late President Roosevelt. "And, say, doctor, be sure to get Mr. Eathorne to come. Insist on it. I think he sticks around home too much for his own health." Eathorne came. It was a friendly dinner. Babbitt spoke gracefully of the stabilizing and educational value of bankers to the community. They were, he said, the pastors of the fold of commerce. For the first time Eathorne departed from the topic of Sunday schools and asked Babbitt about the progress of his business. Babbitt answered modestly, almost filially. A few months later, when he had a chance to take part in the Street Traction Company's terminal deal, Babbitt did not care to go to his own bank for a loan. It was rather a quiet sort of deal, and if it had come out, the public might not have understood. He went to his friend Mr. Eathorne. He was welcomed and received the loan as a private venture, and they both profited in their pleasant new association. After that, Babbitt went to church regularly, except in spring Sunday mornings, which were obviously meant for motoring. He announced to Ted, "I tell you, boy, there's no stronger bulwark of sound conservatism than the evangelical church, and no better place to make friends who'll help you gain your rightful place in the community than in your own church home." End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Babbitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 18. 1. Though he saw them twice daily, though he knew and amply discussed every detail of their expenditures, yet for weeks together Babbitt was no more conscious of his children than of the buttons on his coat sleeves. The admiration of Kenneth Escott made him aware of Verona. She had become secretary to Mr. Gruensberg of the Gruensberg Leather Company. She did her work with the thoroughness of a mind which reveres details and never quite understands them. But she was one of the people who gave an agitating impression of being on the point of doing something desperate, of leaving a job or a husband, without ever doing it. Babbitt was so hopeful about Escott's hesitant ardors that he became the playful parent. When he returned from the Elks he peered coyly into the living room and gurgled, "Has your Kenny been here tonight?" He never credited Verona's protest. "Why, Ken and I are just good friends, and we only talk about ideas. I don't have all this sentimental nonsense that would spoil everything." It was Ted who most worried Babbitt. With conditions in Latin and English, but with a triumphant record in manual training, basketball, and organization of dances, Ted was struggling through his senior year in the East Side High School. At home he was interested only when he was asked to trace some subtle ill in the ignition system of the car. He repeated to his tut-tutting father that he did not wish to go to college or law school, and Babbitt was equally disturbed by his shiftlessness and by Ted's relations with Eunice Littlefield next door. Though she was the daughter of Howard Littlefield, that wrought-iron fact mill, that horse-faced priest of private ownership, Eunice was a midge in the sun. She danced into the house. She flung herself into Babbitt's lap when he was reading. She crumpled his paper.
and laughed at him when he adequately explained that he hated a crumpled newspaper as he hated a broken sales contract. She was 17 now. Her ambition was to be a cinema actress. She did not merely attend the showing of every feature film, she also read the motion picture magazines, those extraordinary symptoms of the age of pep monthlies and weeklies, gorgeously illustrated with portraits of young women who had recently been manicure girls, not very skillful manicure girls, and who, unless their every grimace had been arranged by a director, could not have acted in the Easter cantata of the Central Methodist Church. Magazines reporting quite seriously in interviews plastered with pictures in riding breeches and California bungalows, the views on sculpture and international politics of blankly beautiful, suspiciously beautiful young men, outlined the plots of films about pure prostitutes and kind-hearted train robbers, and giving directions for making bootblacks into celebrated scenario authors overnight. These authorities Eunice studied. She frequently did, tell whether it was in November or December, 1905, that Mac Harker, the renowned screen cowpuncher and bad man, began his public career as a chorus man in "Oh, You Naughty Girlie." On the wall of her room, her father reported, she had pinned up 21 photographs of actors, but the signed portrait of the most graceful of the movie heroes she carried in her young bosom. Babbitt was bewildered by this worship of the new gods, and he suspected that Eunice smoked cigarettes. He smelled the cloying reek from upstairs, and heard her giggling with Ted. He never inquired. The agreeable child dismayed him. Her thin and charming face was sharpened by bobbed hair, her skirts were short, her stockings were rolled, and as she flew after Ted, above the caressing silk were glimpses of soft knees which made Babbitt uneasy and wretched that she should consider him old. Sometimes, in the veiled life of his dreams, when the fairy child came running to him, she took on the semblance of Eunice Littlefield. Ted was motor mad as Eunice was movie mad. 1,000 sarcastic refusals did not check his teasing for a car of his own. However lax he might be about early rising and the prosody of Virgil, he was tireless in tinkering. With 3 other boys he bought a rheumatic Ford chassis, built an amazing racer body out of tin and pine, went skidding around corners in the perilous craft, and sold it at a profit. Babbitt gave him a motorcycle, and every Saturday afternoon, with 7 sandwiches and a bottle of Coca-Cola in his pockets, and Eunice perched eerily on the rumble seat, he went roaring off to distant towns. Usually Eunice and he were merely neighborhood chums, and quarreled with a wholesome and violent lack of delicacy. But now and then, after the color and scent of a dance, they were silent together and a little furtive. Babbitt was worried. Babbitt was an average father. He was affectionate, bullying, opinionated, ignorant, and rather wistful. Like most parents, he enjoyed the game of waiting till the victim was clearly wrong, then virtuously pouncing. He justified himself by croaking, "Well, Ted's mother spoils him. Got to be somebody who tells him what's what, and me, I'm elected the goat, because I try to bring him up a real decent human being, and not one of those sapheads and lounge lizards. Course they all call me a grouch." Throughout, with the eternal human genius for arriving by the worst possible routes at surprisingly tolerable goals, Babbitt loved his son and warmed to his companionship, and would have sacrificed everything for him, if he could have been sure of proper credit. 2. Ted was planning a party for his set in the senior class. Babbitt meant to be helpful and jolly about it. From his memory of high school pleasures back in Catawba, he suggested the nicest games, going to Boston, and charades with stewpans for helmets, and word games in which you were an adjective or a quality. When he was most enthusiastic he discovered that they weren't paying attention. They were only tolerating him. As for the party, it was as fixed and standardized as the Union Club hop. There was to be dancing in the living room, a noble collation in the dining room, And in the hall 2 tables of bridge for what Ted called the poor old dumbbells that you can't get to dance hardly more than half the time. Every breakfast was monopolized by conferences on the affair. No one listened to Babbitt's bulletins about the February weather or to his throat-clearing comments on the headlines. He said furiously, "If I may be permitted to interrupt your engrossing private conversation, did you hear what I said?" "Oh, don't be a spoiled baby. Ted and I have just as much right to talk as you have," flared Mrs. Babbitt. On the night of the party he was permitted to look on, when he was not helping Matilda with the Vichy ice cream and the petit fours. He was deeply disquieted 8 years ago when Verona had given a high school party. The children had been fearless Gabbies. Now they were men and women of the world, very supercilious men and women. The boys condescended to Babbitt. They wore evening clothes, and with hauteur they accepted cigarettes from silver cases. Babbitt had heard stories of what the Atlantic Club called goings-on at young parties, of girls parking their corsets in the dressing-room, of cuddling and petting, and with a presumable increase in what was known as immorality. Tonight he believed the stories. These children seemed bold to him and cold. The girls wore misty chiffon, coral velvet, or cloth of gold, and around their dipping bobbed hair were shining wreaths. He had it, upon urgent and secret inquiry, that no corsets were known to be parked upstairs, but certainly these eager bodies were not stiff with steel. Their stockings were of lustrous silk, their slippers costly and unnatural, their lips carmine, and their eyebrows penciled. They danced cheek to cheek with the boys, and Babbitt sickened with apprehension and unconscious envy. Worst of them all was Eunice Littlefield, and maddest of all of the boys was Ted. Eunice was a flying demon. She slid the length of the room. Her tender shoulders swayed. Her feet were deft as a weaver's shuttle. She laughed and enticed Babbitt to dance with her. Then he discovered the annex to the party. The boys and girls disappeared occasionally, and he remembered rumors of their drinking together from hip-pocket flasks. He tiptoed around the house, and in each of a dozen cars waiting in the street he saw the points of light from cigarettes, from each of them hearing high giggles. He wanted to denounce them, but standing in the snow, peering around the dark corner, he did not dare. He tried to be tactful. When he returned to the front hall he coaxed the boys, "Say, if any of you fellows are thirsty, there's some dandy ginger ale." "Oh, thanks," they condescended. He sought his wife in the pantry and exploded, "I'd like to go out there and throw some of those young pups out of the house. They talk down to me like I was the butler. I'd like to—" "I know," she sighed. "Only everybody says, all the mothers tell me, unless you stand for them, if you get angry because they go out on their cars and have a drink, they won't come to your house any more. And we wouldn't want Ted left out of things, would we?" He announced that he would be enchanted to have Ted left out of things, and hurried back in to be polite, lest Ted be left out of things. But he resolved if he found that the boys were drinking, he would, well, he'd hand 'em something that would surprise 'em. While he was trying to be agreeable to large-shouldered young bullies, he was earnestly sniffing at them. Twice he caught the reek of Prohibition-time whiskey, but then it was only twice. Dr. Howard Littlefield lumbered in. He had come in a mood of solemn parental patronage, to look on. Ted and Eunice were dancing, moving together like one body. Littlefield gasped. He called Eunice. There was a whispered dialogue, and Littlefield explained to Babbitt that Eunice's mother had a headache and needed her. She went off in tears. Babbitt looked after them furiously. "Hello, devil!" Getting Ted into trouble, and Littlefield, a conceited old gas-bag, acting like it was Ted that was the bad influence. Later he smelled whiskey on Ted's breath. After the civil farewell to the guests, the row was terrific. A thorough family scene, like an avalanche, devastating and without reticences. Babbitt thundered, Mrs. Babbitt wept, Ted was unconvincingly defiant, and Verona in confusion as to whose side she was taking. For several months there was coolness between the Babbitts and the Littlefields, each family sheltering their lamb from the wolf cub next door. Babbitt and Littlefield still spoke in pontifical periods about motors and the Senate, but they kept bleakly away from mention of their families. Whenever Eunice came to the house, she discussed with pleasant intimacy the fact that she had been forbidden to come to the house, and Babbitt tried, with no success whatever, to be fatherly and advisory to her. 3. "Gosh, all fish hooks!" Ted wailed to Eunice as they wolfed hot chocolate, lumps of nougat, and an assortment of glazed nuts in the mosaic splendor of the Royal Drug Store. "It gets me why Dad doesn't just pass out from being so poky. Every evening he sits there, about half asleep, and if Rone or I say, 'Oh, come on, let's do something,' he doesn't even take the trouble to think about it. He just yawns and says, 'No, this suits me right here.' He doesn't know there's any fun going in anywhere. I suppose he must be thinking same as you and I do, but gosh, there's no way of telling it. I don't believe that outside the office and playing a little bum golf on Saturday he knows there's anything in the world to do except just keep sitting there and sitting there every night, not wanting to go anywhere, not wanting to do anything, thinking us kids are crazy, sitting there. Lord!" 4. If he was frightened by Ted's slackness, Babbitt was not sufficiently frightened by Verona. She was too safe. She lived too much in the neat little airless room of her mind. Kenneth Escott and she were always underfoot. When they were not at home conducting their cautiously radical courtship over sheets of statistics, they were trudging off to lectures by authors and Hindu philosophers and Swedish lieutenants. "Gosh," Babbitt wailed to his wife as they walked home from the Fogartys' bridge party, "it gets me how Roe and that fellow can be so poky. They sit there night after night whenever he isn't working, and they don't know there's any fun in the world, all talk and discussion. Lord, sitting there, night after night, not wanting to do anything, thinking I'm crazy because I like to go out and play a fist of cards. Sitting there. Gosh!" Then around the swimmer bored by struggling through the perpetual surf of family life, new combers swelled. 5. Babbitt's father and mother-in-law, Mr. and Mrs. Henry T. Thompson, rented their old house in the Bellevue district and moved into the Hotel Hatton, that glorified boarding-house filled with widows, red-plush furniture, and the sound of ice-water pitchers. They were lonely there, and every Sunday evening the Babbitts had to dine with them on fricasseed chicken, discouraged celery, and cornstarch ice cream, and afterwards sit polite and restrained in the hotel lounge while a young woman violinist played songs from the German Via Broadway. Then Babbitt's own mother came down from Catawba to spend 3 weeks. She was a kind woman and magnificently uncomprehending. She congratulated the convention-defying Verona as being a nice, loyal homebody without all these ideas that so many girls seem to have nowadays. And when Ted filled the differential with grease, out of pure love of mechanics and filthiness, she rejoiced that he was so handy around the house, and helping his father and all, and not going out with the girls all the time and trying to pretend to be a society fellow. Babbitt loved his mother, and sometimes he rather liked her. But he was annoyed by her Christian patience, and he was reduced to pulpiness when she discoursed about a quite mythical hero called Your Father. "You won't remember it, Georgie. You were such a little fellow at the time. I remember just how you looked that day, with your goldy brown curls and your lace collar. You always were such a dainty child, and kind of a puny and sickly, and you loved pretty things so much, and the red tassels of your little booties and all. And your father was taking us to church, and a man stopped us and said, 'Major?' So many of the neighbors used to call your father Major. Of course he was only a private in the war, but everybody knew that he was because of the jealousy of his captain, and he ought to have been a high-ranking officer. He had the natural ability to command that so very few men have. And this man came out into the road and held up his hand and stopped the buggy and said, "Major," he said, "there's a lot of folks around here that have decided to support Colonel Scannell for Congress, and we want you to join us. Meeting people the way you do in the store. You could help us a lot." Well, your father just looked at him and said, "I certainly shall do nothing of the sort. I don't like his politics," he said. Well, the man, Captain Smith they used to call him, and heaven only knows why, because he hadn't the shadow of vestige of a right to be called captain, or any other title. This Captain Smith said, "We'll make it hot for you if you don't stick by your friends, Major." Well, you know how your father was, and this Smith knew it, too. He knew what a real man he was, and he knew your father knew the political situation from A to Z, and he ought to have seen that here was one man he couldn't impose on. But he went on trying and hinting and trying till your father spoke up and said to him, "Captain Smith," he said, "I have a reputation around these parts for being one who is amply qualified to mind his own business and let other folks mind theirs." And with that he drove on and left the fellow standing there in the road like a bump on a log. Babbitt was most exasperated when she revealed his boyhood to the children. He had, it seemed, been fond of barley sugar, had worn the loveliest little pink bow in his curls, and corrupted his own name to Goo-Goo. He heard, though he did not officially hear, Ted admonishing Tinka, "Come on now, kid. Stick the lovely pink bow in your curls and beat it down to breakfast, or Goo-Goo will jaw your head off." Babbitt's half-brother Martin and his wife and youngest baby came down from Catawba for 2 days. Martin bred cattle, and they ran the dusty general store. He was proud of being a free-born, independent American of the good old Yankee stock. He was proud of being honest, blunt, ugly, and disagreeable. His favorite remark was, "How much you pay for that?" He regarded Verona's books, Babbitt's silver pencil, and flowers on the table as citified extravagances, and said so. Babbitt would have quarreled with him but for his gawky wife and the baby, whom Babbitt teased and poked fingers at and addressed. "I think this baby's a bum. Yes, sir. I think this little baby's a bum. He's a bum. Yes, sir, he's a bum. That's what he is. He's a bum. This baby's a bum. He's nothing but a bum. That's what he is, a bum." All the while Verona and Kenneth Escott held long inquiries into epistemology. Ted was a disgraced rebel, and Tinka, aged 11, was demanding that she be allowed to go to the movies thrice a week, like all the girls. Babbitt raged, "I'm sick of it. Have to carry 3 generations. Whole damn bunch lean on me. Pay half of Mother's income. Listen to Henry T. Listen to Myra's worrying. People ain't the mat. And get called an old grouch for trying to help the children. All of 'em depending on me and picking on me, and not a damn one of 'em grateful. No relief, no credit, and no help from anybody. And to keep it up for good Lord knows how long." He enjoyed being sick in February. He was delighted by their consternation that he, the Rock, should give way. He had eaten a questionable clam. For 2 days he was languorous and petted and esteemed. He was allowed to snarl, "Leave me alone," without reprisals. He lay on the sleeping porch and watched the winter sun slide along the taut curtains, turning the rusty khaki to pale blood red. The shadow of the draw rope was dense, black, in an enticing ripple on the canvas. He found pleasure in the curve of it, sighed as the fading light blurred it. He was conscious of life and a little sad, with no Virgil Glinches before whom to set his face in resolute optimism, or beheld, and half admitted that he beheld, his way of life as incredibly mechanical. Mechanical business, a brisk selling of badly built houses, mechanical religion, a dry, hard church, shut off from the real life of the streets, inhumanly respectable as a top hat. Mechanical golf and dinner parties and bridge and conversation. Save with Paul Risling, mechanical friendships. Backslapping and jocular, never daring to essay the test of quietness. He turned uneasily in bed. He saw the years, the brilliant winter days and all the long sweet afternoons, which were meant for summery meadows, lost in such brittle pretentiousness. He thought of telephoning about leases, of cajoling men he hated, of making business calls and waiting in dirty anterooms, hat on knee, yawning at fly-specked calendars, being polite to office boys. "I don't hardly want to go back to work," he prayed. "I'd like to. I don't know." But he was back the next day, busy and of doubtful temper. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Babbitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 19. 1. The Zenith Street Traction Company planned to build car repair shops in the suburb of Dorchester. But when they came to buy the land, they found it held on options by the Babbitt Thompson Realty Company. The purchasing agent, the first vice president, and even the president of the traction company protested against the Babbitt price. They mentioned their duty toward stockholders. They threatened an appeal to the courts, though somehow the appeal to the courts was never carried out, and the officials found it wiser to compromise with Babbitt. Carbon copies of the correspondence are in the company's files, where they may be viewed by any public commission. Just after this, Babbitt deposited $3,000 in the bank. The purchasing agent of the traction company bought a $5,000 car. He, first vice president, built a home in Devon Woods, and president was appointed minister to a foreign country. To obtain the options to tie up one man's land without letting his neighbor know had been an unusual strain on Babbitt. It was necessary to introduce rumors about planning garages and stores, to pretend that he wasn't taking any more options, to wait and look as bored as a poker player at a time when the failure to secure a key lot threatened the whole plan. To all this was added a nerve-jabbing quarrel with his secret associates in the deal. They did not wish Babbitt and Thompson to have any share in the deal except as brokers. Babbitt rather agreed. "Ethics of the business broker ought to strictly represent his principals, and not get in on the buying," he said to Thompson. "Ethics rats! Think I'm going to see that bunch of holy grafters get away with a swag and us not climb in?" snorted old Henry. "Well, I don't like to do it. Kind of double-crossing." "It ain't. It's triple-crossing. It's the public that gets double-crossed. Well, now we've been ethical and got it out of our systems. The question is, where can we raise a loan to handle some of the property for ourselves, on the QT? We can't go to our bank for it. Might come out. I could see old Ethorn. He's close as the tomb." "That's the stuff." Ethorn was glad, he said, to invest in character, to make Babbitt the loan, and see to it that the loan did not appear on the books of the bank. Thus, certain of the options which Babbitt and Thompson obtained were on parcels of real estate which they themselves owned, though the property did not appear in their names. In the midst of closing this splendid deal, which stimulated business and public confidence by giving an example of increased real estate activity, Babbitt was overwhelmed to find that he had a dishonest person working for him. The dishonest one was Stanley Graff, the outside salesman. For some time Babbitt had been worried about Graff. He did not keep his word to tenants. In order to rent a house he would promise repairs which the owner had not authorized. It was suspected that he juggled inventories of furnished houses, so that when the tenant left he had to pay for articles which had never been in the house, and the price of which Graff put into his pocket. Babbitt had not been able to prove these suspicions, and though he had rather planned to discharge Graff, he had never quite found time for it. Now into Babbitt's private room charged a red-faced man, panting, "Look here, I've come to raise particularly merry hell, and unless you have the fellow pinched, I will." What? Calm down, old man. What's trouble? Trouble, huh? Here's trouble. Sit down and take it easy. They can hear you all over the building. This fellow Graff you got working for you, he leases me a house. I was in it yesterday and signs the lease. Oh, okay. And he was to get the owner's signature and mail the lease last night. Well, and he did. This morning I comes down to breakfast, and the girl says a fellow had come to the house right after the early delivery and told her he wanted an envelope that had been mailed by mistake. Big long envelope with Babbitt Thompson in the corner of it. Sure enough, there it was. So she lets him have it, and she describes the fellow to me, and it was this Graff. So I phones to him, and he, the poor fool, he admits it. He says after my lease was all signed, he got a better offer from another fellow, and he wanted my lease back. Now, what you going to do about it? Your name is William Varney, W.K. Varney. Oh, yes, that was the Garrison house. Babbitt sounded the buzzer. When Miss McGowan came in, he demanded, Graff gone out? Yes, sir. We look through his desk and see if there is a lease made out to Mr. Varney on the Garrison house. To Varney, can't tell you how sorry I am this happened. Needless to say, I'll fire Graff the minute he comes in. And, of course, their lease stands. But there's one other thing I'd like to do. I'll tell the owner not to pay us a commission, but apply it to your rent. No, straight. I want to. To be frank, this thing shakes me up bad. I suppose I've always been a practical businessman. Probably I've told one or two fairy stories in my time, when the occasion called for it, but, you know, sometimes you have to lay things on thick to impress boneheads. But this is the first time that I've ever had to accuse one of my own employees of anything more dishonest than pinching a few stamps. Honest, it would hurt me if we profited by it, so you'll let me hand you the commission? Good. 2. He walked through the February city, where trucks flung up a spattering of slush and the sky was dark above dark brick cornices. He came back miserable. He who respected the law had broken it by concealing the federal crime of interception of the mail. But he could not see Graff go to jail, his wife suffer. Worse, he had to discharge Graff, and this was a part of office routine, which he feared. He liked people so much. He so much wanted them to like him that he could not bear insulting them. Miss McGowan dashed in to whisper with the excitement of an approaching scene, "He's here." "Mr. Graff?" "Ask him to come in." He tried to make himself heavy and calm in his chair, and to keep his eyes expressionless. Graff stalked in, a man of 35, dapper, glass-eyed, with a foppish mustache. "Want me?" said Graff. "Yes, sit down." Graff continued to stand grunting. "I suppose that old mutt Varney has been in to see you. Let me explain about him. He's a regular tightwad, and he sticks out for every cent, and he practically lied about his ability to pay rent. I found that out just after we signed up, and then another fellow comes along with a better offer for the house, and I felt it was my duty to the firm to get rid of Varney, and I was so worried about it I skun up there and got back the lease. Honest, Mr. Babbitt, I didn't intend to pull anything crooked. I was just wanted the firm to have all the Wait now, Stan. This may all be true, but I've been having a lot of complaints about you. Now, I don't suppose you ever mean to do wrong, and I think if you just get a good lesson, that'll jog you up a little. You'll turn out a first-class realtor yet, but I don't see how I can keep you on." Graff leaned against the filing cabinet, his hands in his pocket, and laughed. "So I'm fired. Well, oh, vision and ethics. I'm tickled to death, but I don't want you to think you can get away with any holier-than-thou stuff. Sure, I've pulled some raw stuff, a little of it, but how could I help it, in this office? Now, by God, young man—" "Tut-tut, keep the naughty temper down, and don't holler, because everybody in the outside office will hear you. They're probably listening right now. Babbitt, old dear, you're crooked in the first place, and a damn skinflint in the second. If you paid me a decent salary, I wouldn't have to steal pennies off a blind man to keep my wife from starving. Us married just 5 months, and her the nicest girl living, and you keeping us flat broke all the time, you damned old thief, so you can put money away for your saphead of a son and your wishy-washy fool of a daughter. Wait now." "You'll by God take it, or I'll bellow so the whole office will hear it." And crooked. Say, if I told the prosecuting attorney what I know about this last street traction option steal, both you and me would go to jail along with some nice, clean, pious, high-up traction guns." "Well, Stan, looks like we're coming down to cases. That deal, there was nothing crooked about it. The only way you can get progress is for the broad-gauged men to get things done, and they got to be rewarded." "Oh, for Pete's sake, don't get virtuous with me. As I gather it, I'm fired. All right. It's a good thing for me, and if I catch you knocking me to any other firm, I'll squeal all I know about you and Henry T. and the dirty little lip-spittle deals that you corporals of industry pull off the bigger and brainier crooks, and you'll get chased out of town. And me? You're right, Babbitt. I've been going crooked, but now I'm going straight. And the first step will be to get a job in some office where the boss doesn't talk about ideals. Bad luck, old dear. And you can stick the job up the sewer." Babbitt sat for a long time, alternately raging, "I'll have him arrested," and yearning, "I wonder, no, I've never done anything that wasn't necessary to keep the wheels of progress moving." Next day he hired in Graff's place Fritz Wellinger, the salesman of his most injurious rival, the East Side Homes and Development Company, and thus at once annoyed his competitor and acquired an excellent man. Young Fritz was a curly-headed, merry, tennis-playing youngster. He made customers welcome to the office. Babbitt thought of him as a son, and in him had much comfort. 3. An abandoned race-track on the outskirts of Chicago, a plot excellent for factory sites, was to be sold, and Jake Offutt asked Babbitt to bid on it for him. The strain of the street traction deal and his disappointment in Stanley Graff had so shaken Babbitt that he found it hard to sit at his desk and concentrate. He proposed to his family, "Look here, folks. Do you know who's going to trot up to Chicago for a couple of days? Just a weekend, won't lose but one day of school. Know who's going with the celebrated business ambassador, George F. Babbitt? Why, Mr. Theodore Roosevelt Babbitt." "Hooray!" Ted shouted. "Oh, maybe the Babbitt men won't paint that old town red." And once away from the familiar implications of home, they were two men together. Ted was young only in his assumption of oldness, and the only realms apparently in which Babbitt had a larger and more grown-up knowledge than Ted's were the details of real estate and the phrases of politics. When the other sages of the Pullman smoking compartment had left him to themselves, Babbitt's voice did not drop into the playful and otherwise offensive tone in which one addresses children, but continued its overwhelming and monotonous rumble, and Ted tried to imitate it in his strident tenor. "Gee, Dad, you certainly did show that poor boot when he got flip about the League of Nations." "Well, trouble with a lot of fellows is they simply don't know what they're talking about. They don't get down to facts. What do you think of Ken Escott?" "I'll tell you, Dad. It strikes me Ken is a nice lad, no special faults, except he smokes too much, but slow, Lord. Why, if we don't give him a shove, the poor dumbbell never will propose. And Roan is just as bad, slow." "Yes, guess you're right. They're slow. They haven't either one of 'em got our pep." "That's right. They're slow, I swear, Dad. I don't know how Roan got into our family. I'll bet if the truth were known, you were a bad old egg when you were a kid." "Well, it wasn't slow." "Bet you weren't. I'll bet you didn't miss many tricks." "Well, when I was out with the girls, I didn't spend all the time telling them about the strike in the knitting industry." They roared together, and together lighted cigars. "What are we going to do with them?" Babbitt consulted. "Gosh, I don't know. I swear, sometimes I feel like taking Ken aside and putting him over the jumps and saying to him, 'Young fellow, me lad, are you going to marry young Roan, or are you going to talk her to death? Here you are, getting on toward 30, and you're only making $20 or $25 a week. When you going to develop a sense of responsibility and get a raise? If there's anything that George F. or I can do to help you, call on us, but show a little speed anyway." "Well, at that, it might not be so bad if you or I talked to him, except he might not understand. He's one of those highbrows. He can't come down to cases and lay his cards on the table and talk straight out from the shoulder, like you and I can." "That's right. He's like all those highbrows." "That's so, like all of 'em. That's a fact." They sighed and were silent and thoughtful and happy. The conductor came in. He had once called Babbitt's office to ask about houses. "Hurry, Mr. Babbitt. We going to have you with us to Chicago? This are your boy?" "Yes, it's my son Ted." "Well, now, what do you know about that? Here I've been thinking you were a youngster yourself, not a day over 40 hardly, and you with this great big fellow. 40! Why, brother, I'll never see 45 again." "Is that a fact? Wouldn't hardly have thought it." "Yes, sir. It's a bad giveaway for the old man when he has to travel with a young whale like Ted here." "You're right, it is. To Ted, I suppose you're in college now?" Proudly, "No, not till next fall. I'm just kind of giving the different colleges the once over now." As the conductor went on his affable way, huge watch chain jingling against his blue chest, Babbitt and Ted gravely considered colleges. They arrived at Chicago late at night. They lay abed in the morning, rejoicing. "Pretty nice not to have to get up and get down to breakfast, eh?" They were staying at the modest Eden Hotel because Zenith businessmen always stayed at the Eden. But they had dinner in the brocade and crystal Versailles room of the Regency Hotel. Babbitt ordered Blue Point oysters with cocktail sauce, a tremendous steak with a tremendous platter of French fried potatoes, 2 pots of coffee, apple pie with ice cream for both of them, and for Ted an extra piece of mince pie. "Hot stuff! Some feed, young fella," Ted admired. You stick around with me, old man, and I'll show you a good time." They went to a musical comedy and nudged each other at the matrimonial jokes and the prohibition jokes. They paraded the lobby, arm in arm, between acts. And in the glee of his first release from the shame which dissevers fathers and sons, Ted chuckled, "Dad, did you ever hear the one about the 3 milliners and the judge?" When Ted had returned to Zenith, Babbitt was lonely. As he was trying to make alliance between Offutt and certain Milwaukee interests which wanted the race track plot, most of his time was taken up in waiting for telephone calls, sitting on the edge of his bed, holding the portable telephone, asking wearily, "Mr. Sagan not in yet? Didn't he leave any message for me? All right, I'll hold the wire." Staring at a stain on the wall, reflecting that it resembled a shoe, and being bored by his 20th discovery that it resembled a shoe. Lighting a cigarette, then bound to the telephone with no ashtray in reach, wondering what to do with this burning menace, and anxiously trying to toss it into the tiled bathroom. At last, on the telephone, "No message, eh? All right, I'll call up again." One afternoon he wandered through the snow-rutted streets of which he had never heard, streets of small tenements and two-family houses and maroon cottages. It came to him that he had nothing to do. That was nothing he wanted to do. He was bleakly lonely in the evening. When he dined by himself at the Regency Hotel, he sat in the lobby afterward, in a plush chair bedecked with the Saxe Coburg arms, lighting a cigar and looking for some one who would come and play with him and save him from thinking. In the chair next to him, showing the arms of Lithuania, was a half-familiar man, a large, red-faced man with pop eyes and a deficient yellow mustache. He seemed kind and insignificant, and as lonely as Babbitt himself. He wore a tweed suit and a reluctant orange tie. Came to Babbitt with a pyrotechnic crash. The melancholy stranger was Sir Gerald Doak. Instinctively Babbitt rose, bumbling, "How are you, Sir Gerald? 'Member we met in Zenith at Charlie McKelvey's? Babbitt's my name. Real estate." "Oh, how do you do?" Sir Gerald shook hands flabbily. Embarrassed, standing, wondering how he could retreat, Babbitt wondered, "Well, I suppose you've been having a great trip since we saw you in Zenith." "Quite. British Columbia and California, and all over the place," he said doubtfully, looking at Babbitt lifelessly. "How did you find business conditions in British Columbia? Or I suppose maybe you didn't look into 'em. Scenery and sport and so on." "Scenery? Oh, capital. But business conditions? You know, Mr. Babbitt, they're having almost as much unemployment as we are." Sir Gerald was speaking warmly now. So, business conditions not so doggone good, eh? No, business conditions weren't at all what I had hoped to find them. Not good, eh? No, not really good. That's a darn shame. Well, I suppose you're waiting for somebody to take you out to some big shindig, Sir Gerald. Shindig? Oh, shindig. No, to tell you the truth, I was wondering what the deuce I could do this evening. Don't know a soul in Chicago. Wonder if you happen to know whether there's a good theater in this city. Good? Why, say, they're running Grand Opera tonight. I guess maybe you'd like that? Yeah, went to the opera once in London. Covent Garden sort of thing. Shocking. No, I was wondering if there was a good cinema show. Babbitt was sitting down, hitching his chair over, shouting, "Movie! Say, Sir Gerald, I suppose of course you had a raft of dames wanting to lead you out to some soiree? God forbid! But if you haven't, what do you say we go to a movie? There's a peach of a film at the Grantham. Bill Hart in a bandit picture. Righto! Just a moment while I get my coat." Swollen with greatness, slightly afraid lest the noble blood of Nottingham change its mind and leave him at any street corner, Babbitt paraded with Sir Gerald Doak to the movie palace, and in silent bliss sat beside him, trying not to be too enthusiastic, lest the knight despise his adoration of six-shooters and broncos. At the end, Sir Gerald murmured, "Jolly good picture, this. So awful decent of you to take me. Haven't enjoyed myself so much in weeks. All those hostesses, and they never let you go to the cinema." "The devil you say!" Babbitt's speech had lost the delicate refinement and all the broad A's with which he had adorned it, and became hearty and natural. "Well, I'm tickled to death you liked it, Sir Gerald." They crawled past the knees of a fat woman into the aisle. They stood in the lobby, waving their arms in the rite of putting on overcoats. Babbitt hinted, "Say, how about a little something to eat? I know a place where we could get a swell rarebit, and we might dig up a little drink. That is, if you ever touch this stuff." "Rather, but why not? Come to my room. I've some scotch. Not half bad." "Oh, I don't want to use up all your hooch. It's darn nice of you, but you probably want to hit the hay." Sir Gerald was transformed. He was beefily yearning. "Oh, really now, I haven't had a decent evening for so long, having to go to all those dances, no chance to discuss business and that sort of thing. Do be a good chap and come along, won't you?" "Will I? You bet. I just thought maybe say, by golly, it does do a fellow good, don't it, to sit and visit about business condition after he's been to all these balls and masquerades and banquets and all that society stuff. I often feel that way in Zenith. Sure, you bet I'll come." "That's awfully nice of you." They beamed along the street. "Look here, old chap, can you tell me, do American cities always keep up this dreadful social pace? All these magnificent parties?" "Go on now, quit your kidding. Gosh, you with court balls and functions and everything." "No, really, old chap. Mother and I, Lady Doak, I should say, we usually play a hand of bezique and go to bed at 10. Bless my soul, I couldn't keep up your beastly pace. And talking. All your American women, they know so much. Culture and that sort of thing. This Mrs. McKelvey, your friend."
"Yeah, old Lucille, good kid."
She asked me which of the galleries I liked best in Florence, or was it Firenze? Never been to Italy in my life. And primitives? Did I like primitives? Do you know what the deuce a primitive is?"
"Me? I should say not, but I know what a discount for cash is."
"Rather, so do I. By George, but primitives?"
Primitives."
They laughed with the sound of a Booster's luncheon. Sir Gerald's room was, except for his ponderous and durable English bags, very much like the room of George F. Babbitt, and quite in the manner of Babbitt he disclosed a huge whisky flask, looked proud and hospitable, and chuckled, "Say when, old chap." It was after the third drink that Sir Gerald proclaimed, "How do you Yankees getting the notion that writing chaps like Bernard Shaw and this Wells represent us?" The real business England. We think these chaps are traitors. Both our countries have their comics, old aristocracy, old country families, hunting people and all that sort of thing. And we both have our wretched labor leaders. But we both have a backbone of sound businessmen who run the whole show."
"You bet. Here's to the real guys."
"I'm with you. Here's to ourselves." It was after the fourth drink that Sir Gerald asked humbly, "What do you think of North Dakota mortgages?" But it was not till after the fifth drink that Babbitt began to call him Jerry, and Sir Gerald confided, "I say, do you mind if I pull off my boots?" and ecstatically stretched his knightly feet, his poor tired, hot, swollen feet, out on the bed. After the sixth, Babbitt irregularly rose.
"Well, better get to hiking along, Jerry. You're a regular human being. I wish to thunder we'd been better acquainted in Zenith. Look it, can't you come back and stay with me for a while?"
"So sorry. Must go to New York tomorrow. Most awfully sorry, old boy. I haven't enjoyed an evening so much since I've been in the States. Real talk. Not all this social rot. I'd never have let them give me the beastly title, and I didn't get it for nothing, eh? If I thought I'd have to talk to women about primitives and polo."
Goodly thing to have in Nottingham.
Though annoyed the mayor most frightfully when I got it. And of course the missus likes it, but nobody calls me Jerry now. He was almost weeping. "And nobody in the States has treated me like a friend till tonight. Goodbye, old chap. Goodbye. Thanks awfully."
"Don't mention it, Jerry, and remember, whenever you get to Zenith, the latch string is always out.
"And don't forget, old boy, if you ever come to Nottingham, Mother and I will be frightfully glad to see you. I shall tell the fellows in Nottingham your ideas about visions and real guys at our next Rotary Club luncheon." 4. Babbitt lay abed at his hotel, imagining the Zenith Athletic Club asking him, "What kind of time did you have in Chicago?" and his answering,
Fair. Ran around with Sir Gerald Doak a lot."
picturing himself meeting Lucille McKelvey and admonishing her,
"You're all right, Mrs. Mac, when you aren't trying to pull this highbrow pose. It's just as Gerald Doak says to me in Chicago. Oh, yes, Jerry's an old friend of mine. The wife and I are thinking of running over to England to stay with Jerry in his castle next year. And he said to me, 'Georgie, old bean, I like Lucille first rate, but you and me, Georgie, we got to make her get over this highty-tighty hoopla-diddle the way she's got.'"
But that evening a thing happened which wrecked his pride.
5.
At the Regency Hotel cigar counter, he fell to talking with a salesman of pianos, and they dined together. Babbitt was filled with friendliness and well-being.
He enjoyed the gorgeousness of the dining room,
The chandeliers, the looped brocade curtains, the portraits of French kings, the guest panel of gilded oak. He enjoyed the crowd, pretty women, good solid fellows who were liberal spenders. He gasped, he stared, and turned away, stared again. 3 tables off, with a doubtful sort of woman, a woman at once coy and withered, was Paul Risling. And Paul was supposed to be in Akron, selling tar roofing. The woman was tapping his hand, mooning at him and giggling. Babbitt felt that he had encountered something involved and harmful. Paul was talking with the rapt earnestness of a man who is telling his troubles. He was concentrated on the woman's faded eyes.
Once he held her hand, and once, blind to the other guests,
He puckered his lips as though he was pretending to kiss her. Babbitt had so strong an impulse to go to Paul that he could feel his body uncoiling, his shoulders moving. But he felt desperately that he must be diplomatic, and not till he saw Paul paying the check did he bluster to the piano salesman,
"By golly, friend of mine over there. Excuse me a second. Just say hello to him."
He touched Paul's shoulder and cried,
"Well, when did you hit town?"
Paul glared up at him, face hardening.
"Oh,
"Hello, George. Thought you'd gone back to Zenith." He didn't introduce his companion. Babbitt peeped at her. She was a flabbily pretty, weakly flirtatious woman of 42 or 3, in an atrocious flowery hat. Her rouging was thorough but unskilful.
"Where you staying, Paulibus?"
The woman turned, yawned, examined her nails. She seemed accustomed to not being introduced. Paul grumbled, Campbell Inn on the South Side. Alone? It sounded insinuating. Yes, unfortunately. Furiously, Paul turned toward the woman, smiling with a fondness sickening to Babbitt. May, I want to introduce you. Mrs. Arnold, this is my old acquaintance, George Babbitt.
Pleased to meet you,
Growled Babbitt, while she gurgled, "Oh, I'm pleased to meet any friend of Mr. Risling's, I'm sure." Babbitt demanded,
Be back there later this evening, Paul? I'll drop down and see you.
"No, better. We better lunch together tomorrow."
All right, but I'll see you tonight, too, Paul. I'll go down to your hotel and I'll wait for you.
End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of Babbitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt, by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 20. 1. He sat smoking with the piano salesman, clinging to the warm refuge of gossip, afraid to venture into the thoughts of Paul. He was the more affable on the surface as secretly he became more apprehensive, felt more hollow. He was certain that Paul was in Chicago without Zilla's knowledge, and that he was doing things not at all moral and secure. When the salesman yawned that he had to write up his orders, Babbitt left the hotel in leisurely calm. But savagely he said, "Campbell Inn," to the taxi driver. He sat agitated on the slippery leather seat, in that chill dimness which smelled of dust and perfume and Turkish cigarettes. He did not heed the snowy lake front, the dark spaces and sudden bright corners in the unknown land south of the Loop. The office of the Campbell Inn was hard, bright, new. The night clerk harder and brighter. "Yep," he said to Babbitt.
Mr. Paul Risling registered here.
"Yep."
Is he here now?
"Nope."
Then if you'll give me his key, I'll wait for him.
"Can't do that, brother.
Wait down here if you want to."
Babbitt had spoken with the deference which all the clan of good fellows give to hotel clerks. Now he said with snarling abruptness,
"I may have to wait some time. I'm Risling's brother-in-law. I'll go up to his room. Did I look like a sneak thief?"
His voice was low and not pleasant. With considerable haste the clerk took down the key, protesting,
"I never said you looked like a sneak thief. Just rules of the hotel. But if you want to."
On his way up in the elevator, Babbitt wondered why he was here. Why shouldn't Paul be dining with a respectable married woman? Why had he lied to the clerk about being Paul's brother-in-law? He had acted like a child. He must be careful not to say foolish, dramatic things to Paul. As he settled down, he tried to look pompous and placid. Then he thought, suicide. He'd been dreading that without knowing it. Paul would be just the person to do something like that. He must be out of his head, or he wouldn't be confiding in that. Dried-up old hag. Zilla, oh, damn Zilla now. How gladly he'd throttle that nagging fiend of a woman. She'd probably succeed at last and driven Paul crazy. Suicide. Out there on the lake, way out, beyond the piled ice along the shore. It'd be ghastly cold to drop into the water tonight. Or throat cut in the bathroom. Babbitt flung into Paul's bathroom. It was empty. He smiled feebly. He pulled at his choking collar, looked at his watch, opened the window to stare down the street, looked at his watch, tried to read the evening paper laying on the glass-top bureau, looked again at his watch. 3 minutes had gone by since he had first looked at it, and he waited for 3 hours. He was sitting fixed, chilled, when the doorknob turned. Paul came in, glowering. "Hello," Paul said. "Been waiting?"
"Yeah, a little while."
"Well?"
"Well, what?" "Just thought I'd drop in to see how you made out in Akron."
"Did all right. What difference does it make?"
"My gosh, Paul, what are you sore about?"
"What are you butting into my affairs for?"
"Well, Paul, that's no way to talk. I'm not butting into nothing. I was so glad to see your ugly old phiz that I just dropped by in to say howdy."
"Well,
I'm not going to have anybody following me around and trying to boss me. I've had all of that. I'm going to stand." "Oh, gosh, I'm not." "I didn't like the way you looked at May Arnold, or the snooty way you talked." "Well, all right then. If you think I'm a Buttinsky, then I'll just butt in. I don't know who your May Arnold is, but I know doggone good and well that you and her weren't talking about tar roofing. No, nor about playing the violin, neither. If you haven't got any moral consideration for yourself, you ought to have some for your position in the community. The idea of you going around places gawping in a female's eyes like a lovesick pup. I can understand how a fellow slipping once, but I don't propose to see a fellow that's been as chummy with me as you have getting started on the downward path and sneaking off from his wife, even as cranky as one of Zilla, to go woman chasing." "Oh, you're a perfectly moral little husband." "I am, by God. I never looked at a woman except Myra since I've been married, practically, and I never will. I'll tell you there's nothing to immorality. Don't pay. Can't you see, old man? It just makes Zilla still crankier." Slight of resolution as he was of body, Paul threw his snow-beaded overcoat on the floor and crouched on a flimsy cane chair. "Oh, you're an old blowhard, and you know less about morality than Tinka. But you're all right, Georgie. But you can't understand that I'm through. I can't go Zilla's hammering any longer. She's made up her mind that I'm a devil. Regular Inquisition torture. She enjoys it. It's a game to see how sore she can make me. And me? Either it's find a little comfort, anywhere, or else do something a lot worse. Now this Miss Arnold, she's not so young, but she's a fine woman, and she understands a fella, and she's had her own troubles." "Yeah, suppose she's one of those hens whose husband doesn't understand her." "I don't know. Maybe. He was killed in the war." Babbitt lumbered up, stood beside Paul, patting his shoulder, making soft, apologetic noises. "Honest, George, she's a fine woman, and she's had one hell of a time. We manage to jolly each other a lot. We tell each other we're the dandiest pair on earth. Maybe we don't believe it, but it helps a lot to have somebody with whom you can be perfectly simple, and not all this discussing, explaining." "And that's as far as you go." "It is not. Go on. Say it." "Well, I can't say I like it, but—" With a burst which left him feeling large and shining with generosity. "None of my darn business. I'll do anything I can for you, if there's anything I can do. There might be. I judge from Zill's letters that I've been forwarded from Akron that she's getting suspicious about my staying away so long. She'd be perfectly capable of having me shadowed, and of coming to Chicago and bursting into a hotel dining room and bawling me out before everybody." "I'll take care of Zilla. I'll hand her a good fairy story when I get back to Zenith." "I don't know. I don't think you better try it. You're a good fellow, but I don't know that diplomacy is your strong point." Babbitt looked hurt, then irritated. "I mean with women. With women, I mean. Of course they got to go some to beat you in business diplomacy, but I just mean with women. Zilla may do a lot of rough talking, but she's pretty shrewd. She'd have the story out of you in no time." "Well, all right, but—" Babbitt was still pathetic at not being allowed to play secret agent. Paul soothed. "Of course, maybe you might tell her you'd been in Akron and seen me there." "Why, sure, you bet. Don't I have to look at candy store property in Akron? Didn't I? Ain't it a shame I have to stop off there when I'm so anxious to get home? Ain't it a regular shame? I'll say it is. I'll say it's a doggone shame." "Fine, but for glory hallelujah's sake don't go putting any fancy fixings on the story. When men lie they always try to make it too artistic, and that's why women get suspicious. And let's have a drink, Georgie. I've got some gin and a little vermouth." The Paul who normally refused a second cocktail took a second now, and a third. He became red-eyed and thick-tongued. He was embarrassingly jocular and salacious. In the taxicab, Babbitt incredulously found tears crowding into his eyes. 2. He had not told Paul of his plan, but he did stop at Akron, between trains, for the one purpose of sending a postcard to Zilla, with "Had to come here for the day. Ran into Paul." In Zenith he called on her. If for public appearances Zilla was overcoiffed, overpainted and resolutely corseted. For private misery she wore a filthy blue dressing-gown and torn stockings thrust into streaky pink satin mules. Her face was sunken. She seemed to have but half as much hair as Babbitt remembered, and that half was stringy. She sat in a rocker amid a debris of candy boxes and cheap magazines, and she sounded dolorous when she did not sound derisive. But Babbitt was exceedingly breezy. "Well, well, Zill, old dear, having a good loaf while hubby's away? That's the ideal, I'll bet a hat. Myra never got up till 10 while I was in Chicago. Say, could I borrow your thermos? Just dropped in to see if I could borrow your thermos bottle. We're going to have a toboggan party. Want to take some coffee, Mitt. Oh, did you get my card from Akron saying I'd run into Paul?" "Yes. What was he doing?" "How do you mean?" He unbuttoned his overcoat, sat tentatively on the arm of a chair. "You know what I mean." She slapped the pages of a magazine with an irritable clatter. "I suppose he was trying to make love to some hotel waitress or manicure girl or somebody." "Hang it, you're always letting on that Paul goes around chasing skirts. He doesn't, in the first place. And if he did, it would probably be because you keep hinting at him and dinging at him so much. I hadn't meant to, Zilla, but since Paul is away in Akron—" "He really is in Akron. I know he has some horrible woman that he writes to in Chicago." "Didn't I tell you I saw him in Akron? What are you trying to do, make me out a liar?" "No, but I get so worried." "Now there you are. That's what gets me. Here you love Paul, and you plague him and cuss him out as if you hated him. I simply can't understand why it is that the more some folks love people, the harder they try to make 'em miserable." "You love Ted and Rone, I suppose, and you nag them." "Oh, well, that's different. Besides, I don't nag 'em, not what you'd call nagging, but just saying, now here's Paul, the nicest, most sensitive critter on God's green earth. You ought to be ashamed of yourself the way you pan him. Why, you talk to him like a washerwoman. I'm surprised you can act so doggone common, Zilla." She brooded over her linked fingers. "Oh, I know I do go and get mean sometimes, and I'm sorry afterwards, but oh, Georgie, Paul is so aggravating. Honestly, I've tried awfully hard these last few years to be nice to him, but just because I used to be spiteful, or I seemed so, I wasn't really, but I used to speak up and say anything that came into my head, and so he made up his mind that everything was my fault. Everything can't always be my fault, can it? And now if I get to fussing, he just turns silent, oh, so dreadfully silent, and he won't look at me. He just ignores me. He simply isn't human, and he deliberately keeps it up till I bust out and say a lot of things I don't mean. So silent. Oh, you righteous men, how wicked you are! How rotten wicked!" They thrashed things over and over for half an hour. At the end, weeping terribly, Zilla promised to restrain herself. Paul returned 4 days later, and the Babbitts and Rislings went festively to the movies and had chop suey at a Chinese restaurant. As they walked to the restaurant, through a street of tailor shops and barber shops, the two wives in front, chattering about cooks, Babbitt murmured to Paul, "Girl seems a lot nicer now." "Yes, she has been, except once or twice. But it's too late now. I'm not going to discuss it, but I'm afraid of her. There's nothing left. I don't ever want to see her. Some day I'm going to break away from her. Somehow." End of chapter 20.